We are live. This is the April 11th, 2018 meeting of the Node.js modules team. Thank you to those who are watching live. I'm going to take a second and just tweet the link. If anyone has some business to just bring up really quickly that's not on the agenda, please feel free to take this moment to bring it up. Okay, so moving to the agenda that we have 13 members on the call right now, which is not quorum. We would need, I believe, 21 people to have quorum. Perhaps another 8 people can show up between now and then. John, I see you're on the call. You sometimes are in a room with some other Microsoft employees. Is it just you today, or are you with others?
It's just me today.
Okay, cool. Sounds like an old school dot matrix printer in the background. I don't know.
I don't know that. I don't think that's mine.
Oh, I love it, whatever it is. Okay, so moving forward on the agenda, the first things that we have right now are approving PRs. Unfortunately, we do not have quorum to approve these PRs, so the 2 meeting notes will not be able to land. But we have a 5-minute time box to discuss the membership rules. I'll present that really quickly, and then if anyone has any concerns, this would be a good time to maybe bring it up. I just did a quick hack at trying to put together some basic rules for the team. Essentially, it changes the definition. We have it mentioned as collaborators right now, and I changed that to be members. And then I provide a more granular definition of both active members and observers, specifically what the ability, like which each group has. And just while I'm doing this, Michael, I'm making you a co-host, so if anyone else joins, you'd be able to promote them. That active members are invited to all meetings, can participate in the consensus-seeking process, which is itself defined lower down. They're counted towards quorum in team meetings and participate in votes. Observers, alternatively, are invited to all meetings, can participate in the consensus-seeking process, not counted towards quorum in team meetings, and cannot participate in voting. This is a very important distinction in there, in that unless a decision moves to a vote, all members and observers equally participate in the consensus-seeking process. And by the definition of how I put it together, even an observer would be able to object on something if they didn't want it to land. They just wouldn't be able to participate in the actual vote. So essentially, and due to the fact that we so rarely have votes, the idea here would be that it would allow observers to be essentially full participants, but it would stop, like, so for example, right now with only 14 people on the call, we're not actually able to approve and move things forward that require quorum to do so. So I figured that this was a good balance between keeping people engaged, empowering people to participate in the process, but not blocking parts of our governance that essentially require a count to move forward. There is also rules here on how to become a member of the team. It specifies that membership is not time limited and there's no fixed size, that there's no specific requirements or expectations or qualifications to join. That changes to the team membership should be proposed with a pull request and labeled for modules agenda to be approved via consensus seeking. That a team member unable to attend a meeting where a planned membership decision is being made, their consent is assumed. That new members must first join as observers, and that essentially you open a pull request to make yourself an observer. After that has been approved, observers can open a pull request to make themselves full members. And that at any time, a member or an observer can, move themselves to observers or remove themselves from the team entirely, and that doesn't require consensus seeking. So the short version of this process would be that essentially anyone can add themselves at any time, and it just requires consensus of the team to have them added. Someone can move from being not a member of the group at all to being a full-fledged member of the group in 2 meetings. So like that process at minimum would take 2 weeks, but due to the rules as we have it right now, like they more or less would be able to observe and participate in the meeting. They just wouldn't be part of the vote. And the big kind of tweak on language there is making sure that anyone who is joining, who, if you want to move yourself down or move yourself out, that can't actually be blocked by anyone and doesn't require consensus seeking. So if anyone, doesn't want to participate anymore, they should be able to do that themselves. The rest of this pull request is mostly a refactoring, and those are individual commits, but more or less our consensus seeking process had some language conflated throughout the governance doc, especially in the landing PRs. So I just refactored that out. Does anyone have any concerns or questions about the PR in its current state? Cool. I will take, John, please.
Yeah, so we currently have an issue open for Jeffrey of TypeScript to become, or sorry, CoffeeScript, my bad, CoffeeScript maintainer to become an observer, but that's not a pull request. Should that just be transferred to a pull request? Does that delay the discussion till 2 weeks from now?
No, I mean, so what's going to actually delay the discussion is the fact that we don't have quorum right now.
Okay.
The only reason I didn't ask them to open a pull request is because I didn't want to create unnecessary work if we didn't have consensus on this process.
Okay.
So that's why I actually had him becoming an observer as a standalone issue for us to deal with as a one-off.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Yeah, because I just didn't want to ask people to do things if we didn't have quorum around it.
Okay.
So any other questions for right now? Okay, so with that being said, we unfortunately do not have quorum at the moment, so we can't really move forward on any of this. We do have, actually, let's take a look right now. Unfortunately, everyone who signed off on this, aside from Mateo, is in this meeting. Of the 15 people, is there anyone who has more than one person in their room right now? Yeah, so we don't have quorum, so we'll have to move forward. If we end up having quorum at any point in the meeting, I'll stop and move back to this so that we can dig in. So back to the agenda, we have, we're on to the discussion now. So we did have the can I be an observer. That was the issue that was opened by Jeffrey, who was asking if he could join as an observer. One thing that we could potentially do, and we don't need quorum right now, is we could ask Jeffrey to open a pull request, adding themselves as an observer, and attempt to reach quorum with enough approvals within that issue. Does anyone see anything problematic with doing that? Okay, so I have no objections to them joining as an observer. It doesn't seem like anyone else does. We only need a few more people to join the call before the end, so let's just move past that.
Okay. He's actually watching the live stream.
Okay, awesome. Glad to hear that. And Jeffrey, since you are watching, I have my eyes on the YouTube chat. Please feel free to throw anything in there. I'm sorry that the process is somewhat rigid right now. Just trying to make sure that we kind of set this up properly so that we can consistently support people in this. And we're slowly getting closer to quorum, so we may be able to do this.
So for the minutes, I'm just typing in, ask him to PR himself, open a PR to add himself, and we'll look to get enough approvals that move forward. Is that the right answer? Right?
Yeah, unless we can reach quorum before the end of this meeting, in which case that may not be necessary, and I'll take care of the pull request.
Okay.
So the next one that we have, let's just make sure we're at 45 minutes right now. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna drop we may skip the membership requirements, but let's keep a 10-minute time box on this cache system mismatch with web. Brad, do we have you on the call right now?
I'm around, yeah.
Do you want to lead on this, or do you think John could or someone else could just kind of introduce this topic?
So I'll just give a brief summary. I've got a cough. basically, I overlooked something a couple of years ago and didn't realize that we are caching our module records using a different model than how the web is caching things. It doesn't work how Node does stuff in CommonJS, Babel does stuff, Webpack does stuff, Rollup does stuff, etc. The web specification is different. It closely models how CSS works with @import, but it's a little different due to having a module map, which CSS does not have. So in that issue, I kind of go over some indirection differences. It isn't just symlinks. I could probably dig up different ways to do this, but the overall problem is the web is creating entries in the module map for a module namespace upon request before it gets the final destination. So before it does redirects or any form of indirection, it creates the module map entry, and Node doesn't, because Node wants to know the final address, essentially the real path. So after all the indirection, that's what we're using for the key instead. This means you can have differences in what it means to load modules that have a form of indirection. And we just need to discuss, like, do we want to match the web, which has some inherent value in it? Do we want to just kind of go with how Webpack, Babel, and everything work right now? Either way, we're going to cause some kind of divergence, either by breaking how symlinks work in Webpack and Node today, or by not being compatible with the web's model for indirect. Needs to be an argument about, do we need a consistent mental model for indirection? And that also needs to go in that thread. So that's the brief summary without going into technical details. So that's it.
Okay, thank you, Brad. Does anyone have anything else to add for right now to this one?
I mean, from the discussion on GitHub, like one of the comments was that the purpose of import.meta.url is to give a URL that relative requests should be considered relative to. And if Node wants to include import.meta.url, that seems like the mental model we should mimic. And I think that I don't know exactly what that conclusion that triggers, but it definitely seems like it has an impact on indirection and symlinks and package JSON main resolution and stuff like that.
So summary of the difference between the two models here is, since the web is putting things in the module map when it's requested, that is not what it is using for import meta URL. It's using the final location, whatever gets a 200 basically, for the value of import meta URL. Unlike Node, which, since we're going with the destination, the import meta URL matches one-to-one with a cache key in the module map. So on the web, import meta URL is not unique and does not represent your module namespace or record. In Node, Webpack, and other people who've been using this syntax, it is unique and represents a module record. So there's some trade-offs there, and matching the web also means removing some use cases for import meta URL.
I think Dominic might be open to allowing things like that fragment to be added to import meta URL now that it was raised, as they're trying to allow the fragment to be added to other places. So it might be more closely aligned with Node and Safari technical preview there. So there might be like a light or a positive outlook on that.
Yes, that will help a lot, but you still can't rely on it to be a unique identifier. So.
Right.
I mean, is there any possibility of adding an alternative or additional import meta property that provides like the module cache key or something like that, and still enable the use cases in Node we're interested in without it like diverging from the web entirely?
Well, if our cache model differs, it doesn't really, well, if our cache model differs, import meta URL kind of doesn't make as much sense because it's not reliably the same thing across the different environments.
Would this be a case for import meta dir name, file name, all that stuff?
John, 1 second. We have people with their hands up.
Sorry.
Rebecca, if you could go, and then John, if you throw your hand up, I'll get you next. Rebecca, if you're speaking, you're currently muted.
Thank you. The main thing that jumps out to me about this is that if we're changing how relative specifiers work, and that's the most important part from this, and I can see how they would necessarily be different between the web and what Node's current behavior is. Like if I do an import of a relative of a module name or a relative path from the web, it's going to be relative to the URL that I requested that object from, not wherever it happened to be stored on the server, because the web doesn't have access to that. Whereas historically, as was said earlier, symlinks, we follow the symlinks and then we resolve relative to the symlink, where the symlink was located. And this becomes important because this has to do with, this relates to how NPM lays out your node modules and how it, where it puts modules, because when you say I depend on this, we need to put your dependency in a place that you can load it. And this is the case today with the preserve symlinks flag on Node.js. If you run npm in an environment with that configured, we will install your dependencies directly, like inside of your in your node modules. Whereas if you use it without that, we'll put it off inside of the symlink itself, because it's the only part it can see. It can't see the rest of your project. What I'm concerned about is getting into a situation where some modules have this behavior enabled and other modules don't. And I don't know how we would resolve that in a way that would be consistently, that would be a weird scenario. Like, I guess we could do that. That is a thing that we could support, but it's a weird place to be. So I would be very cautious about following, like, this might be a place where we need to diverge from the web's behavior just because of our own legacy.
John, you're up. As a heads up, we have 51 seconds. Would people like to extend the time box on this? We still have a few minutes, so I'll add 5 more minutes to this. John, you're up. Sure.
I was actually, I didn't realize that Wes had actually asked the same question about, well, if import.meta.url won't be appropriate for Node's case, what about a new meta property instead? I think Wes suggested path, but mine was the same comment.
Okay, great. John, thank you for that. Brad?
So we could add a new property, and we probably shouldn't try to fill the same use cases by diverging on import meta URL. So I would say we probably do need a new property for some use cases, but I would need to go over those, just like make a use case document for the things that were expected and we now should not rely on import meta URL for. And I want to second Rebecca's concerns here. I don't think the ecosystem is well suited to handle the legacy burden of changing how caching works. We could do it because we haven't shipped import unflagged in Node, but that it doesn't act this way in any tool that I've been trying to dig up for the past 48 or so hours. Okay, I need to stop talking.
Okay. So just kind of like, I guess, a question to the room. Like, first off, I'm a big +1 on making new import meta properties if they fit our needs more. I don't think that there's a need to like kind of change what meta import URL does if it doesn't really fit our uses. Would it be useful to try to set up a call with people from the working group or from like the stakeholders that are working on these standards to try to, talk through this in a meeting, either by inviting them to our next modules meeting or planning a meeting around that? Would anyone be interested in that? Should I take silence as a yes?
Yes.
Okay, I'll refer to our process and assume that no objections is an ecstatic yes, and we can move forward with that. We have 2.5 minutes left for right now, but since those were added time, that's added time that we did. Do we want to just move on to the next agenda item at this point? I will take the lack of speaking as, once again, ecstatic support. John, as the person who has been primarily taking lead on our use cases discussion, would you like to kick this off?
Sure. I think we can pick up because Jordan's here. So last week we had to skip over his use cases. We could start with those. And I just facilitate the discussion. So I'll let Jordan, do you have the link handy?
I will drop the link.
I don't, I'm mobile, but if it can be shared, then I can,
Okay.
I could read from the
Sure.
share.
I'll paste it into our panel's chat.
Thank you.
There it is, I think.
All right, let me see if I can pull that up.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, so the first one I put was that a user has a large application and they want to be able to gradually migrate from their current CJS usage to ESM. And that CJS or transpiled CJS, it's kind of the same thing, but one file at a time, but without having to change the entire code base. So that means not having to change every file all at once, but also it means changing one file from CJS to ESM and not having to update every consumer of that file necessarily. There obviously will always be cases where you will have to, but that it's ideal to have that be a strong possibility that you don't have to. Then the next one, which isn't showing up with a bullet point, is that somebody wants to update their package to use ESM, but also wants to continue supporting code bases that use CJS, and similarly wants to migrate that package one module at a time, one file at a time, however you want to call it, similarly without forcing that change to cascade through their whole code base, and also not always, but hopefully most of the time, not creating a breaking change.
By breaking change, you mean like API, syntax, and all of that?
Breaking change meaning anything reasonably observable to the consumer. And I'm
okay.
only adding in reasonably there because there's obviously some like pretty extreme, insane things people could do, but let's not count like people looking at function lengths and function toString and stuff, things like that.
Okay.
And then the next one, so somebody has a non-Node application, let's say a very large Rails app from 6-7 years ago, that may not be able to have a node-based build system. For example, it's using Sprockets, which is the asset system historically built into Rails.
Right.
So, and it's very easy to get stuck on an older Rails version. So let's say that's the case. So in their Rails ERB template, they'll need a way to determine if a file is a script or script type module without having a JavaScript parser available, because in such a setup, the only JavaScript parsers available are heavyweight and require compilation and don't really work very well.
And that's a use case that's close to you, right?
Yes,
Okay.
It is. So that's that one. And then the last one I have on my list here is that, so somebody who works at a company or on a team where they're unwilling to change their coding style or add build processes to what they already have or whatever, but they want to consume a package that was published by somebody that is using only ESM in their package, meaning somebody built a package without being concerned with CJS backwards compatibility. So there should be some way for them to consume that package on an older version of Node as well as a newer one without, so like, in other words, they should not be required to update their Node version in order to get it working, and upgrading their Node version should not break what they already have working. There you go.
Okay. Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think it's easy to start thinking about implementation here, but we'll try to keep that out for just the use cases.
Yeah, it's really difficult to keep that out of the.
It is, because that's where my
document
mind
too.
Is there a next steps where we can go? Because last week we, just for a summary for folks that weren't here, we talked about several use cases that were very web centric. And we also talked at the same time about package map. So there was always a lot of comparisons going back and forth between the two. Is there a next steps now that we have some solid use cases and we can start to see where there is very web centric, there's dev centric, there's interop scenarios and things like that, that we should, what are the next steps for these use cases that we have?
So I'm unable to raise my hand in the interface. So
Sure.
I'm going to physically raise my hand. I think that the next steps for us at this point would be translating these use cases into explicit features or user experience, and then beginning to discuss those. So, I mean, what we could do right now would be maybe like almost one-to-one or in another doc, we could go through those use cases and translate those to feature requirements. And one thing I do want to say is, like, especially for this stage, let's try to remain in a yes and mode. So rather than talking about the reason why certain features shouldn't exist, let's make an extensive list of all potential features. And then once we have that, we can start refining what features make sense. And potentially, even as we start to kind of like stack rank features by importance, figure out features that are kind of anti-features. But we should do that at a later stage rather than right now. This should still be considered like early wayfinding in defining the interface.
Okay.
Does that sound reasonable to everyone? Please feel free to push back or suggest otherwise. I'm just kind of making it up as I go. Jordan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just that does sound reasonable. I think that I like the yes and for now. I am concerned about the later part of that. I think that that we should be very, very cautious at any point in discarding or disregarding or marginalizing anyone's use cases. There are plenty of use cases of mine that I would not want marginalized, and there are plenty of use cases of other people I might want to marginalize, but that I would like to treat as fairly as I hope to be treated. So I hope that we can go forward in as much of a spirit as possible of supporting as close to every use case as we can.
Yeah, and I think approaching this to start as a yes and, making a list of all features, then from that, picking up the features that we have absolute consensus on, will then allow us to start discussing amicably and respectfully the features that aren't in agreement so that we can sort it out. And I think we all know or have an idea of the features we'll get to that we don't have consensus on, but hopefully by following this framework, we can make that conversation a little more guided and less contentious. John, would you like to still kind of take lead on guiding this, or would you like to hand off the baton to someone else?
I'll hand off if you want. I really like the yes and approach. It sounds like, because I mean, at the moment we've gone over most of the use cases, and others are there for people to review in the document. So I'm ready for the next steps on that, whatever we have to do there.
Okay. If you're happy to continue to lead it, I'm happy to not.
Okay, that's fine too. Okay.
So I guess the first thing is, and Jordan has their hand up. So maybe Jordan, would you like to go first?
Oh, that was from before. I never lowered it.
Oh, okay, it's lowered. Do people think it makes sense to do this in the same doc, or should we move to a new doc that has like a pointer to the old doc?
I noticed from just having it sit in this document, it kind of sat for a while with folks coming in very, very, very little to disturb the document. So I don't know if it needs to be in a place that encourages contribution better than a document. Or I know GitHub is chatty, but that seems to get a lot of attention. So maybe that could be the place. But we're going to need a bunch of feedback and contributions to it if it's going to go forward.
So one reason I think a new document may be good, and the first thing that we can draft would be kind of not a manifesto, but like a list of how we're approaching the document, because we don't have quorum right now. Not everyone in the group is going to understand the process that we're taking towards this. And so perhaps what I would suggest is a new doc with a link pointing to the use cases doc that we're building this off of, and a paragraph, and I can take that as an action item to do after this, but a paragraph just kind of outlining the process that we're doing currently as a wayfinding exercise, and that essentially we're not critiquing features right now, we're collecting features, and just making that explicit to people.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Cool. So I can, John, do you want to go ahead and make that new document?
Yes, I'll do that. And then I'll even open the GitHub issue. And then if you want to pop in there with a summary or something, that's fine too.
Okay, that's great. And Rebecca just added a great thing to, Rebecca's hand's up. So I'll let Rebecca put himself.
So just very briefly, we should probably number the use cases so we can refer to them. And then ideally have people cite what use case their solution is solving, so that it's always clear, because it won't always be clear. And then like sometimes, and some many solutions will solve many use cases. So
I'll go back through and number them then.
Excellent.
Okay. All right. Well, does anyone have a use case that wasn't covered last week that they'd like to cover this week and give more information on? I can't see the hands, so I'll pop back in.
There are no hands right now.
There are no hands. Okay. Because
I'm not sure if all the use cases are covered, but perhaps if we don't treat this rigid, maybe we can start making features. And then if we have missing features, we can require a use case to be written to bring that feature in. And just
Sure. Just wanting to give people if they have any thing they want to say about them before we move on. So cool.
Yeah, it's definitely easy to add to something that's already there than the first time. So.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
So, John, do you have a link to the new document?
No, but I can get it.
Okay, great.
Sorry, you're going to watch me type. So if you want to move on while I'm doing this, that's fine too.
Okay. So while John's doing that, maybe we can pause this discussion for a second and move to what we had next on the agenda, just so that we can talk about it. And then John, just feel free to jump in when you're ready to start up again. And that's the discussion of membership requirements, which is issue number 43. We've kind of talked about this back and forth. We've not really reached consensus. We tried to do something earlier around this, and that was not well met for good reasons. It was poorly communicated. But we're now into our second meeting in a row where we haven't had quorum, which has blocked our ability to land things based on our current process and is now actually actively blocking us from adding new people to the group. And I think that that is a real telltale sign that there is a problem when people who are not actively involved are stopping people who want to be actively involved from getting involved. We did decide to push the conversation last week also because we didn't have quorum, but I think that it's important to have it right now. What I'm thinking about doing, and I'd like to just get people to chime in if they think that it's not really fair, is I want to go through and take a look at our past meeting notes, take a look at the tracker, identify people who have not participated at all, people who have not commented on any issues, who have not commented on any pull requests, and not participated in any meetings. And I will individually message them and request that they move themselves to an observer status. That's one option. The other option is that I can open a PR, but that may feel like a call out. It didn't seem to go over well the last time. My concern with this is, while it's more polite to do it indirectly that way, since people have not been active, there is the risk that that lack of activity would be a lack of activity in a response to an email. So if anyone has any advice or thoughts on how to approach this in like a kind and fair way, I'd really appreciate some thoughts.
I think sending out the direct email privately first sounds good. And maybe we agree that, after, if there's no response after you repeat it after a week or something, if there's no response for some period, is it 2 weeks or 3 weeks? I don't know. Then we consider that they're not active anymore.
Yeah, well, maybe what I should do is I will try to get to this today or tomorrow. I'll email everyone who hasn't been active. And what we can do from there is if I have not heard from anyone by the next meeting, then we can revisit this and hopefully we'll have quorum and be able to make a stronger decision. And that will just be a little bit more evidence to discuss when we're there. We can do it without directly naming names or anything. I think we'll be fine.
One heads up, I forget their name. Somebody in the ComCom has created a tool which will scan the repo and tell you who has been at meetings or not.
Oh, really? That's...
So it's probably worth reaching out. They were basically saying, they can turn on additional repos on request. So
yeah, would you be able to look that up and figure out who that is after the meeting and just give me a ping?
Yeah, I'll try and do that as we continue here.
Yeah, and Gus, to your question about attendance for meetings, I'll make a couple arrays and I'll write a little script. It will be annoying, but it's a one-off if it doesn't exist, and just do this properly. And we'll figure it out. Okay, cool. John has posted a link for a new doc for node module use cases, or for the feature rundown. If people can open that up and take a look. I can see we've got a couple people in there. I can see that I indeed can edit it. You can see I just put some noise in. So we've got about 15 minutes left on the meeting. And John, please take it away and guide us through this process.
Okay. Hello. Sweet. All right, so I've opened a document here. I'm going through and numbering the use cases, so then we can start to break out the features of each of those use cases. You can pick one, add them in, and I'll go through and organize if I need to the feature breakout. So start thinking of features that relate to the use cases. That's it for me. It's going to be a lot of document editing right now and digging through them. So I don't know if there's anything we need to discuss in chat about it, unless someone has a question about a feature or wants to discuss a possible feature that is being broken out from the scenarios or use cases. No? Okay.
One thing that I can we could maybe start with, and I know this is kind of backwards and maybe not the best to the process, but I think that there's a couple of obvious features that we already know about. And maybe we can get those down and kind of work backwards to the use cases that those fix. Is that useful, or should we just start from a use case and talk about the features?
Well, it sounds like you have a feature in mind. So what feature do you have in mind?
We should be able to import ES modules.
Okay.
That's what I just meant, is like, there's a few features that we definitely need to be able to ship a product.
Okay.
And I think that those are fairly uncontroversial.
Right.
But going through this list, so Alice is writing a new library. So one that we have here from number 2 from CJ is multiple format modules. I don't know how we want to state it, but like the use case specifically says he publishes a package that exports both kinds of interfaces. So the ability to expose multiple interfaces in a package.
Okay. That's, I believe, a dual package.
I would like to keep it more broad than dual package, because I think that it's possible that with infinite modes, there would be infinite number of potential.
I see.
And we should also probably call out multiple interfaces for a given import path through a package JSON main, and then separately through a deep import path.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
I will let editors add that in so they get the wording just right.
May require some clarification on the use case as well.
Sure.
Or an additional use case.
Or let's, you know what, for that use case, maybe we keep it as dual mode, because that's kind of what that use case was saying, and we can add another one for infinite mode when we get there, and then we can reconcile those afterwards.
Right.
Because I think I am, in fact, going against my own advice at this moment.
Well, you could say it was a yes and, dual mode and, more than dual mode.
But yeah, so then maybe dual goal packages and multi-mode packages, and we can put those as separate features because we can. So Carol's updating her popular code coverage reporting tool for a new world. She's able to instrument test code. So that seems like it would be
code coverage integration.
Does everyone agree that that is a good summary of that use cases feature? So
the next one, if I guess I can go down the list too. Next one is transpilers, and on demand for a given language. That to me is like a Babel register. It's a transpiler on demand. So that is a scenario. If that is not the one Siege had in mind, we can revisit that too. But that happens to be a scenario, which is loaders in real time.
Yeah, at import time, I believe, was the intent of that.
Mm-hmm. So that would be Babel register. There might be a TypeScript equivalent. The ESM loader is a similar thing. It's a runtime instrumenter and transpilation.
So I called that real-time loaders transpilation at import time.
Oh,
is that an accurate description of that feature?
Yeah, you could also say that code coverage as it is in tools today is very much like that too, because at runtime they instrument and run code as well. So it becomes really similar. There, one is changing the syntax, one is adding bits around the syntax.
Awesome. That will be great in the next filter to kind of munge those together into a meta feature.
Yeah. Wants to load modules from a database and not from the file system. I don't have any. I don't know what that
Would that
is.
be like loading from arbitrary sockets?
Like creating a module from arbitrary source text, I think.
Right. Like the source text shouldn't have to come from the file system.
Oh,
This
okay.
may actually have some overlap with our discussion of symlinks and redirects, right? Because in that scenario, presumably, the relative module resolution should happen relative to, whatever's in the parent module, rather than having to come up with some sort of URL for like the blob in the database, right? There is no real path there. So maybe,
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
I'm not sure on that, but loading from a database seems fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, if there's no real path, then relying on the real path might turn out to be a fraught decision.
Okay, so let's see what that generated in terms of loading from arbitrary.
One way to describe it might be to call it a virtual module.
Ooh. Okay. Would this cover the VM case?
Not exactly.
Okay. Because that's kind of like creating a synthetic or like virtual module.
Yes, but VM gives you hooks into the
yes.
JavaScript spec. It's not just source text or format.
So this is more like, is this like something to detect what kind of module it is from source text? Because that could go into unambiguous, which is a feature request too.
I mean, maybe, but I hear it more as I have source text. I want to make a module from it. So like if instead of a module I said function, it would be the function constructor, as opposed to like the syntax or something.
Right.
It's a little bit more than that, but that is the heart of it.
Okay.
The additional part is that it should be importable. Like you import a specifier, and that goes and creates a synthetic module and returns that.
Okay.
Synthetic, I like that.
Do you want to be on task for writing that line item? Okay.
Sure. I mean, is it basically asking for hooks that you basically are informed when the import is made, and then you have the ability to provide the content?
That is a way that it could be implemented.
It's sort of like the final outcome of module resolution might not be a file on the file system.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. So arbitrary sources for module source text. Is that a good way to phrase it?
That seems pretty good.
Might also be non-file protocol in general.
I guess the non-file, that description makes me think that perhaps you could have other ways of prefixing it or whatever to tell it where you want to come from. This sounded more like, I just want you to request it in the standard way, and then you have an opportunity to do whatever you want before it actually gets loaded.
I'm going to suggest that we move on to the next use
case
of time. That is obviously a really interesting one that we'd all like to explore more though. So I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, I was going to say that the next one's pretty straightforward. It's module mocks. So the feature is mocks for testing and dependency replacement injection.
Is that something you can do with the previous one?
Well, it's something you can do in CommonJS, yes.
Yeah, there's Rewire is a really great example of that, where you can use Rewire to specify from a module, reach into its internals and replace modules. So like that's really useful if you want to mock a file system module, or if you want to mock a network request. Now, there's a meta discussion about mocking and whether or not it's a good testing practice, but that is not really our place to make platform decisions.
There's another one also unrelated to that about how mocking needs to work when we statically link our graph, because you're no longer statically linked.
Right.
Well, nothing is statically linked when you use a dynamic import.
The bindings are still statically linked.
Okay, so we're in a yes and mindset. So right now the request is mocks for dependencies, and there is a established scenario and it like micro ecosystem around it with tools to do this or ways to do this. Okay, so the next one is back to Jordan's. Needs to support a way of granular migration. So I'm thinking the feature request there is granular migration, a file at a time.
Or a module at a time if people are opposed to mentioning the word file.
Sure.
Jordan, do you think that this could be simply phrased as interoperability?
Yes and no, because I mean, yes, if you include the requirement that consumers should not automatically have to update when you migrate a file. But I feel like interoperability is a really broad brush and a potentially controversial one.
Yeah, I think that's a little too broad.
As a yes and on here, and the reason I suggested it this way is I think that it's good to identify high level ones that have multiple use cases that they serve. So I would say
break it out.
In the spirit of yes and, you're talking about interoperability, which is a high level feature, and then let's talk about specifics as a secondary feature. Because I think if we do that, we start to notice patterns of like interoperability of something that there's like 100 use cases for, but then the specifics of it will start to clear about.
Okay, I mean, but if we then interoperability, like I feel the need to have a tagline under there, like for both direction migration in both directions, and then also like interoperability across files, not just across packages. But yeah, I mean, I can see your argument.
It's sort of like per module modes, whereas some discussions have talked of like per package modes, like if you have Node.js and package.json.
Yeah, and that mode, the method of determining that mode is a future discussion. But yeah, I like that.
I broke this up into 4 potential features, and tell me if these seem verbose, but module interoperability, bidirectional interoperability, transparent interoperability, and per module mode.
Sounds great.
Sounds good.
Okay, cool. And I think that when we start breaking it up granularly like this, I hope we'll see some patterns. So the next one, John, sorry.
Sure, yeah, no worries. It's more on interop, I believe, and that is for how do you support the case where a person is stuck on an older Node version, but wants to be able to consume ESM.
I thought 9, the first thing they say is it's a non-Node application.
Oh, I'm on 10, sorry. Let me go back to 9. Yes, so this one here was getting at the thing where they have no indicator of, they don't have a JavaScript parser, but still need to be able to determine module format.
Yeah, no parsing required is how I would probably phrase it.
So no parsing detection, parse goal detection.
Sure. Well, yeah, via parsing, I guess. But yeah.
Module goal detection or source goal detection. What are we calling it? It's goal. It's a goal. Parse goal without parsing.
I think parse goal is the right term.
Yeah. Okay. Then the other one is being able to consume a package without being concerned about whether it's common JS or ESM.
So that would go under by transparent interop.
Yeah, that's more interop. There's also the addition that it's without requiring a newer Node version.
And maybe you could say polyfillability or something.
Yeah.
Which your package, of course, addresses very well.
Yeah, that's a thing. I'm trying to think about like how do I materialize JustWorks into a list of items. So that's my homework, is to take my JustWorks and say, what does that actually entail? And then break that all down. Okay, so now we are on to number 11. Updating code coverage tool, basically saying I think we've already covered this, which was the code coverage, but this says on par with CommonJS, which just means a non-less than experience for ESM. So great code coverage.
Yeah, so I've gone and just tossed that back under code instrumentation.
Okay, good.
And so if you take a look at the doc, I've just been stacking when we have multiple use cases that are talking about the same features.
Right, yeah, cool. Let's see, the next one. Okay.
So tree shaking.
Tree shaking with CommonJS?
So I'm going to start by just saying tree shaking because it's identified that we also want tree shaking or the ability for tree shaking in ESM because we don't really have that yet. That's, I guess, like an assumption of number 12.
I would say like my only experience with tree shaking is that it works primarily with ESM.
It can work just fine with CJS. There is a tool for it. It's just that the bigger bundlers haven't integrated it.
Correct. Yeah. So I wasn't quite sure if this was wanting a CommonJS feature where tree shaking is good though. That's.
I would actually say that maybe this falls under transparent interop.
Okay.
Because, like as a requirement for transparent interop, because I think the idea here would be is if you're importing CommonJS, you don't want to lose your tree shaking.
Right.
I think Jan had to drop, but let's file this under transparent interoperability as well.
Right. And tree shaking is a good feature on its own, regardless of module format.
Yeah. But should we call it tree shaking or should we call it named exports? Because really, tree shaking is
dead code elimination.
Dead code. But I'll rephrase it. It's like dead code elimination really only makes sense when we're talking about shipping assets to production in like a web environment where you're grabbing everything over the wire. Where what we really care about here is named exports, where you're only executing the code that's in your path. Like there's similar, maybe.
But that applies to defaults too. I could import a default and never reference it, and then that would be dead code.
Yeah, there's actually an npm package. A Webpack plugin for this kind of thing. Which I think that might be an indirect reference to.
So I'll go ahead and I just added named exports as its own use case, separate from tree shaking and separate from interoperability, and then we can sort that out afterwards.
Okay. Yeah, because I also don't think it's unique to bundlers because there's parse time and like load time impacts on Node if you can skip evaluating modules, for example.
Right.
It has just dawned on me that we are at 4:04. We've gone over the hour. End of meeting not found. I think I forgot to hit play on my timer. We are on a roll right now. I'm not in a rush to leave the meeting, but we should stick to the time if we have to. Just quickly to the room. Does anyone think that we should stop or do people want to keep going?
I mean, we're not going to finish the document today, so we should definitely keep going in future meetings with this process. This is great.
Yeah. So with that being said, since we did hit the time, since other people aren't here, and it's probably fair to make sure that other people can participate in this process, perhaps we just call it a meeting for now. Feel free to take those features and keep doing this in the document as we were doing, unless. I kind of feel like I want to keep going for at least another 5 minutes because we're kind of have a good pace going right now. Bye, Rebecca. I think she said that they need to go. Let's just finish the list that we're on. That was Margot's suggestion. Let's finish this one list from Jan and then move forward.
Okay. All right. So the next one is reads the source from a project, finds an import statement. They want to quickly find the file being imported. So that is like a debug. Or clear. This could even be debuggability, inspectability. I know that there's an ask for improved error messages for ESM. That again, also they want to know where things are coming from, what's being imported. So those
kind of like require.resolve for import, maybe.
Yeah. Quickly find the file being imported. Well, we do know that that is a use case, and that is file resolve or path resolve or require.resolve are things that people do. So I would see that as being a feature.
So is it runtime? At runtime, they want to like be able to print something that logs where it was pulled in from, or programmatically?
We'll have to get
that out?
Sure.
We'll have to get.
I mean, I can imagine import.meta.resolve where it at runtime and maybe even in the browser, it gives you whatever the final location is of the module.
I put that as file path resolving for module. Does that reasonable for people?
But also, I would say URL resolution too, if we support URLs.
And I was going to say, if there's an arbitrary way of getting the contents, it should give you information about whatever way it was, right?
So we could even make that a step further and like module metadata, retrievable module metadata.
That's nice.
Is it runtime or is it just static? Like looking at.
I've put a question in the scenario to ask if it's runtime, debug, or static, and so we can.
I think because of dynamic import, it would have to be runtime as well.
Yeah. But I'll defer to.
I see.
J.K. Rems on that.
Someone just added to file path URL resolving the retrievable module metadata, but I actually broke that out into its own feature because there's other metadata that isn't path related that we may be interested in as well.
All right. The next items here are like questions. What are people doing with CommonJS? What are people doing in other module systems? What are people doing in the module system in Node? So it's more like exploring, trying to dig in and find out other use cases. What do people dislike or miss using the module system in Node? So those are more questions than features. Quinn refactors an app and switches it from existing CommonJS, implement to using ESM, rewrite their code, and after reading Node's docs, without relying on trial and error, reading all READMEs. So basically this is clear, easy to use, not overly complex.
Ergonomic?
Yeah. Ease of use, ergonomic, intuitive.
This seems to also be hinting towards transparent interop in the way that they're saying that it can be done without relying on trial and error or reading all READMEs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not exclusively, but I agree additionally.
Yeah.
Yeah, things like named imports for CommonJS modules, like built-ins.
Right. Maybe not having gotchas around them. Okay. Joe has
migration there. I'm throwing that in. That's a nice.
I think we already have a migration point somewhere in there, so we could +1 that or double up on that.
I don't see it. I think maybe it was there. But...
Yeah, Jordan has something about it.
I think it ended up in one of the 4 interoperability categories.
I see. Okay. And then the last one here is Joe has written an ES module that leverages WASM. So WASM support.
Yeah.
And
that relates to multi-mode as well.
Totally.
Although it's distinct.
I would say that too, yes, because I yes. Multi-mode, you mean CommonJS and ESM.
Yeah, modules that aren't
and WASM and maybe and HTML, things like that.
Okay.
Totally.
I was thinking more of loading WASM. If you can load it in ESM, you should be able to load it in CommonJS. But yeah, WASM.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So we have a really good set of use cases that are starting. We've gotten, about halfway through the doc. And then, between now and the next meeting, let's ping people, try to get them to add some more use cases. Let's actually, this is a good question to the group. Should we hold off on these features until the meeting, or should we allow people to work on the way up to the meeting? Because I think doing it in the meeting at least has the benefit that everything that's on that list has been discussed.
Right. There's some shared context.
That's good.
So maybe we should just put a note at the top of the doc as to please hold off to the next meeting to edit that doc, but allow people to continue adding use cases up until then, because
right, have your features ready for discussion.
Would it make any sense to let people expand on those? Like, because there's, you know, some of the titles are fairly terse.
So what I'm imagining we would do, Michael, is like we would collect all of those specific features. Then the next iteration would be grouping them into kind of clusters and then compressing them into like higher level features. And then from there, turning into actual implementation. So for example, like the interop stuff would all just become part of the interop story. And then we could turn that into like more explicit.
Okay, so it might be too early to start expanding the actual use cases, is what I think I'm hearing.
Yeah, that's what I personally feel. I'm open to anything. You know, this is really flexible, and we don't need to be too prescriptive about it.
Right, we haven't made cuts yet, so we're just expanding.
Yeah, and I think that falls very in line with the kind of yes and approach. That way, we're not overthinking it, and it's very much just about like discovery rather than discussion. And I think that will allow us to really build out this list without getting contentious. Okay, great. We ran a little long. Does anyone have any last minute business or things to add before we call it a day? Cool. Well, thank you everyone for your time. We're keeping up our streak of hyper productive meetings, and it's really exciting. And I'm really happy to see that we've moved this a step forward. It feels that we're getting closer to the goal. So thanks everyone. I'm going to stop the stream now. Have a really great